good to see everybody out this morning. We're continuing our study of the book of Matthew. This morning we'll be looking primarily at Matthew chapter 18. Just a few things I wanted to let everybody know. The new Bible should be here Tuesday, and we'll be having those by Wednesday. Something that I am thinking about doing going forward is we're hoping to have more visitors in the near future than we did in the past. And one of the things I was planning on doing is writing down the page numbers of whatever our text is going to be that comes from the Pew Bible. Coming out, and I think it's March. If you happen to like it, there's one on the pew in front of Cora here. They're going to have leather-bound editions of the same I guess layout would be the way to think of it, as the Pew Bible. So if you happen to really like it, like I said, I'll be using that to try to make it more approachable to people who may not have studied the scriptures that much in the past. We sometimes take for granted that we know the order of the books of the Bible. It's something that people don't necessarily take into consideration, and especially if you're studying with someone for the first time that's not familiar, it's a big deal. And some people are embarrassed and they don't want to ask people, and trying to integrate things and make the Bible as accessible as possible for anybody who wants to study it. And in addition to that, it's a pretty good layout. The only thing, me and Glenn were looking at it, it does go nearly to the edge of the paper. That's the one thing I don't like about it, so you can't really make marginal notes. But other than that, it's a pretty nice layout. So once again, Matthew chapter 18, this is the fourth of our lessons on the discourses of Matthew. If you remember back, our first discourse was the Sermon on the Mount. That was primarily the way that people within the kingdom deal with people on the outside of the kingdom. The next was the limited commission. That was telling how we bring people into the kingdom. The third was the parabolic discourse, which had to do with the way that the kingdom of heaven behaves. This morning we're looking at what's called the discourse of the church. Now, the discourse of the church, where the Sermon on the Mount was how we deal with people on the outside, the discourse of the church is primarily how we deal with people on the inside. There's a lot of material in this one chapter, and I'll be honest, of the 5 discourses, this is probably my favorite. The reason is this tells us how we interact with our brothers and sisters in Christ, and that's a very important topic to discuss. And there's a few different ways you can break it down. I put in the bulletin, there is a cause and effect theme that goes throughout this entire chapter, especially in the second section there from verses 7 through 9 about this if-then. So that's a theme that continues throughout. There is this idea of the little ones that continues throughout this entire chapter. The way that I want us to look at it this morning is in terms of value. What things have value, and how do we attribute value to the things that are supposed to have value? I listened to a podcast that's these 2 guys who have dedicated their lives to weightlifting. But in addition to being weightlifters, they have normal lives. One of them was historically, he had done business in marketing, I believe, and the other one had owned a gym and ran a small business. And one of the big things they talk about is things that give them value. Whenever we look at the way that we interact with our brothers and sisters, which is the major theme here, understanding what truly has value in this world is a backdrop behind everything that we do. And ascribing things the proper value is important for us to properly interact with one another. The main things we're going to be looking at this morning are what is our own value, and our own value in as what can we actually contribute? What is our, when we're comparing ourselves to God, what kind of value do we actually hold? Second is, what is the value of our body here on earth? Third, what is the value of one lost soul? Fourth, what is the value of reconciling with our brother? And 5, what is the value of forgiveness? Okay, so those are the main things we're going to be talking about this morning. So the first one we're going to talk about is what Andy read. It's the value of our personal ego. Who is the greatest? To me, this is kind of an ironic statement, because this was probably something that was going on throughout Jesus' entire ministry. And depending on which gospel account you're reading, it's in different places. And if you remember, in John's account, he places this right before he washes the disciples' feet. What can we as Christians do to make God more God than he already is? Nothing, right? The value that we can give God to be greater than what he already is basically nothing. The value that he ascribes to us is insurmountable. He was willing to give his son. My joke is, Jesus paid such a great price, he deserves a little change back. Get it? Okay. One smile. That's about as much as I usually get out of that. It's smart humor. Or maybe it's just bad. Jesus here says, if you want to be great in the kingdom, you need to be like a child. Now, specifically, the child mentioned here is a paidon, or paidon, depending on which group of pronunciations you're using. A paidon is not the same thing as a teknon, which is what's used in 1 John, where it says, my little children. This is a little bit different. A paidon is what we would call a toddler. He takes this little kid, puts them in their midst, and says, if you want to be great, you need to be like that. Going back to the paradoxical kingdom that we talked about a few weeks ago. We're turning everything upside down. If you want to be great, you need to be small. Now, what did Jesus mean specifically whenever he said, become like a little child? Because there's a lot of things that a little child does. One thing is they can have a dirty diaper right when you're trying to leave to come to church and make you 10 minutes late. Is that what he's saying you need to be like as a little child? There's also an element of complaining, right? Little kids can be naggy and want things. I've heard people use this as an argument for why we should have infant baptism. Now, anyone who actually knows their material knows that's a terrible argument. But the primary thing that he's trying to draw on here is the type of reliance that children have on their parents is the same type of reliance that we should have on God. What can James back there do for himself? He can bat toys, laugh, and every now and then he can roll over. That's about it. When we think about our relationship with God and the way that we actually contribute to our own salvation, that's basically what we're able to do too. We can gain access to that salvation, but it's not anything that we did to earn that salvation. As Paul describes it, it's a free gift. Whenever we think about the way that we need to interact as Christians with God, humility is one of the most cornerstone, foundational ideas that we have to have. That our reliance on God needs to be like a toddler for their parents. Next, read with me verses 7 through 9. Woe to the world for temptations to sin, for it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. They gouge their own eyes out. When you got 2,000 years of history, I guess there's bound to be somebody who's done it. That's not what this is talking about. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, after these discourses, there's several narrative sections that come afterward, and they all relate back to the narrative. And especially in this one, there's two stories that happen in chapter 19. So the first one is about Jesus' teaching on divorce. The backdrop of the teaching on divorce is there were two major rabbis at the time, and one said basically you can get divorced for any reason. The other one said that there were certain reasons that you could be, but not every reason. And that was kind of the backdrop of this. And the Pharisees come to him and they ask to him, okay, which one of these guys is right? Time to pick sides. Who's right? And instead of appealing to these two rabbis, instead Jesus appeals to Eden. And he says, greater than anything that was in the law of Moses was the way things were whenever you were created. But if you go down to verse 10 of chapter 19, the disciple said to them, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive it, receive it. The eunuchs who were made eunuchs by man is pretty obvious what that's talking about. Eunuchs who are eunuchs by birth, it's pretty obvious what that's talking about. The eunuchs who are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of God is a fulfillment of what we're reading here in Matthew chapter 18. If there's something that's keeping you from doing it, in this case, being with a woman, you need to make sure that you're doing that. So in a sense, you're cutting off your hand to make sure you don't sin. So if someone has been divorced for an unscriptural reason and have no right to marry, they've made themselves a eunuch. That's fulfillment of 18. Skipping on down, the story of the rich young man, I won't read the entire thing there, but you remember the story. There was a rich young man. He had great riches, probably hadn't earned these himself, likely was an inheritance of some sort. And Jesus said, well, you need to keep the commandments. Are you doing that? And he says, I've always done that. He says, well, there's one thing that you lack. Sell what you have, give to the poor, and come follow me. In his case, his right hand was his riches. Whatever it is that's keeping you from following Jesus the way you're supposed to, you've got to get rid of it. Whether that be your riches, whether that be maybe your job, the people you hang around with, the bad habits you have. Jesus says you just need to completely get rid of it, because it's better for you to be maimed in this world and go to heaven than to have your body intact and go to hell. The value of our salvation is more valuable than anything we can have here on earth. Continuing on, verses 10 through 14. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven the angels always see the face of my Father who's in heaven. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. I've seen, I don't know if this is a popular thing right now, but I've seen in a few things on Facebook and maybe, I guess it was the news media and some things like that, of people who criticize the church using this as an example of some of the dumb things the church does. I'd like to point out, it doesn't seem very smart to leave the 99 and go find the one until you're the one. They've argued that this is neglecting the whole for the sake of one, and that's not really what it's doing at all. The whole point of this story is the value of each individual person is so great that we need to do whatever it takes to go get that person. Whenever we think about people who are lost, who are of the fold, because that's who this is specifically addressing, we're going to talk about in a second how to win brothers back, but Doug mentioned this morning, those who have not been attending because they've gone back into the world. And that's who this is specifically addressing. Looking at what we just read and looking at this, understanding the value of salvation and understanding the value of one's soul is something that we can't put a price on. I've heard people say, I hate hearing this, but we can't afford to do that. We can't afford to do that mission trip. We can't afford to support this, support that. It's just not cost effective. If you ever want to see me upset, and I don't get upset terribly often, start connecting money and lost souls. Because the value of one lost soul, if we invested $1 million, no, we don't have that right now, but if we invested $1 million and one person was saved because of that investment, we came out money ahead. Because that's the true value of souls. Greater than anything we can ever have here on earth. And getting one lost person to come back, Jesus says, that's actually more valuable, at least in the short term, than all of us who are here and doing just okay. Because our salvation is secure. Theirs isn't right now. So next we're going to talk about the value of our brothers. Starting in verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault, between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, in accordance with the law. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it'll be done by them and my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am among them. The church is bad at reconciliation. The church is really bad about reconciliation. Because people in the church don't like people to be mad at them. That's reasonable. But what this points out, I think, and something that we in the church, the reason why we've not been good at this, most people who get offended by something don't realize they offended somebody. So that's the first thing. Second, if they've sinned against you and you haven't at least opened the dialogue that, hey, you did something wrong, they might even see it as something that you endorsed. So in order for us to be better going forward than we have been in the past, it's really important for us to talk to one another, to tell people, and to use the... It does not say, if your brother sins against thee, go complain to the elders, and the elders will go talk to them in secret. The elders will take care of this problem that you're... A lot of it would stop there. Because I truly believe the members who are here today want each other to go to heaven more than anything else in the world. Our two primary goals here on earth: prepare our lives to go to heaven, get as many people to go with us as we can. Those are our two primary goals. The way that we do that has to do with growing closer to one another, growing closer to God, understanding the Scriptures better, all of those things that help us do those two missions. We can't do the second part of the mission unless we follow this template. And it's important for us to find reconciliation with our brothers and sisters. Because if you vow of it, why? Look here, starting in verse 21, the parable of the unforgiving servant. Then Peter came up to him, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. So 10,000 talents, depending on whose math you look at and how much value, if these are silver talents or gold talents, this is something like $15 billion. Okay? $15 billion. Now, how do you run up a debt like that? That's a good question, but $15 billion. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all those who had and the payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, have patience with me, and I'll pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the master of the servant released him and forgave his debt. But when the same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. So, a denarii is a day's wages. Most people say that's about $50. So, 5,000. Somewhere between 10 and 15 billion and 5,000. And seizing him began to choke him, saying, pay what you owe. So his fellow servants fell down and pleaded him, have patience with me, and I will pay you. He refused and went out and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw this had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should you not have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from the heart. I've always thought it was kind of ironic that you throw somebody in prison until they can pay a debt, because if they're in prison, they can't work to make money to pay you off. But that was the way they did things back then. This is the exact model of how debtor's prison, that's what this was. Couldn't pay you, throw them in prison until they could pay it. Nobody's working, can't pay it, they stay in prison. The major illustration here, though, is the values that are given here. This astronomical high amount of money that we don't even see that kind of money today, right? $15 billion, I think Apple, Microsoft, some of the oil companies, and Walmart are worth that much, and that's the whole company. Facebook, I think at one time was worth that much. So we're talking about tremendous amounts of money that the point of it is no one would live long enough to ever be able to pay it. No one could do anything that would ever be able to pay it. The forgiveness that God gave us by giving His Son is something that we can never pay. That's the point of it. But the beauty is we don't have to. It's free. It's an opportunity that we have to become one of His children and share in the inheritance. So Jesus says here, if you look at that type of forgiveness, that's what you received. Whenever a brother does something against you, no matter how bad that was, because I will say 100 denarii is still quite a bit of money at that time. 100 days' wages is still a lot of money. But when you compare that to what God has done for us, the comparison is insurmountable. There's no way that we can ever come close to the type of forgiveness that God has given us. Therefore, we need to do the same to other people. So when you do go to that brother, when you do tell them that they have done something against you, it's your responsibility as the person who was sinned against to forgive them. As long as they're willing to receive that forgiveness, as long as they ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness is a great thing. Forgiveness puts you back into the situation where you should have been before. This morning, do you sit having, let's use his words, 10,000 talents worth of sin on your back that needs to be forgiven? God can do that. Through baptism, we have forgiveness of sins. Our slate is wiped clean, and we're put in a situation where it's like we never sinned. We have that opportunity today. And it doesn't cost you any money. It doesn't cost you anything, but costs you everything. Have you been in a situation where you haven't forgiven your brother? Maybe you've taken for granted the type of forgiveness that we have and not shown that forgiveness to others. Maybe there's something that is your right hand you need to cut off. Maybe that one lost sheep is you. This morning I challenge you to come home as together we stand and as we sing.